Hi, Steve.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. My first question, I would like you to introduce yourself. As you know, as a kid, you told me a little bit about yourself, and then how you grow your business and how your business became successful in the world of cars.
Okay. I was born and raised in Queens, in Long Island. My dad worked for the post office. I basically came from pretty meager backgrounds, not wealthy. And at a very early age, I went to work part-time for Nathan's, which if people that are my age and probably younger also know, Nathan's was not only a fast food restaurant, it was a fast food restaurant, but fast food in a different way than we know what fast food is today. The food was actually cooked in the kitchen and brought out and sold. You could get a deli sandwich, you could get a shrimp platter, you could get clams on the half shell, homemade soup, homemade pizza, and obviously Frankfurter's hamburgers and stuff like that. I started as a busboy, and because I really loved cooking and baking, they brought me into the kitchen where I learned how to cook roast beef and corned beef, because all of that stuff was made in the kitchens of the store, seafood, stuff like that. And then eventually my next step was I became a counterman, selling frankfurters, making pizza, serving the customers one-on-one. I was a breakfast cook there. And it started at the age of 15, and eventually I joined the union. And at that point in my life, when I was probably 17, graduated high school already, didn't go to college, or went to college part-time for about a year. I joined the union, and I became a union steward for a year or two, and eventually I found a job as a driver transporter for a leasing company in Long Island, and worked for them for about a little less than a year and left. And one of their competitors found out that I was available, and I was a nice, bright young boy. I started when I was 18. At 19, I went to work for their competitor for about a year and a half. And throughout the years, had worked my way up from being a driver or a gopher to a salesman in-house to a salesman on the road, and eventually went into business, the leasing business, back in 1981 with some friends of mine that were in the leasing business, and some money people, and we were in business for about 5 years, sold, and then in 1989, during that 3 years, 86 to 89, I helped the company that bought us run out the portfolio of cars. I sold. I realized writing on the wall was being an owner and not a salesperson. And I ended up, after meeting with a couple of different Ferrari dealers in the tri-state area, because exotic cars really was my forte, I met the people at Miller Motor Cars, Richard Koppelman, and in 1989 I went to work at Putnam, and I was given a small percentage of the business until they knew that I was worthy of getting more. That happened within 6 months, and I became partners with the people at Miller. Then they have several franchises, and we started in the basement of their dealership in Greenwich, and presently we have an office in Greenwich with 30 employees. And I am the CEO, and have been the CEO of Putnam since 1989, 1990. And other than cooking, this is the only thing I know how to do. And probably the only hobby that I have besides my two little beautiful girls is I love watches.
Which is when the business really started to pick it up.
Yeah, I've actually been involved in the exotic car end of the leasing business since the very late 70s, early 80s. Prior to the late 80s, every car manufacturer did not offer a lease program. If you wanted to go in hypothetically in 1980 or 1981 and buy a new Mercedes and wanted to lease it, you couldn't go. There was no Mercedes-Benz credit. There was no BMW credit. There was no Porsche Financial, no Lamborghini Financial. It was independent leasing companies such as myself. And back in 1986, all the major car manufacturers, Mercedes, Porsche, BMW, Land Rover at the time, they all went into the leasing business. And the only ones that really didn't at that time was Ferrari, Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Lamborghini, Maserati back then. And of course, dealing with the classic cars, cars from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, was really my forte. And when the manufacturers went into that business in 1986, everybody, there were leasing companies that either were bought out by other leasing companies or went into specialized fields such as trucks and ambulances and stuff like that, which I had no passion for. I had passions for the exotic cars, and I had no competition, or very little competition back then in doing that, which made Putnam Leasing as successful as it is today.
What's your passion about exotic cars?
I like old stuff. I'm an old car guy. You know, new stuff, as beautiful it is, doesn't really interest me as much as an older Mercedes, an older BMW, an older Porsche, because back then those cars were made by hand. They weren't made by machine. There was no plastic in those cars. It was metal. It was leather, real leather. There was no leatherette. And I grew an appreciation for those cars because although the market goes up and down, they're always worth money.
Yeah. And when did the watch came in this passion of...
Laurent, I'm going to tell you, I have the first watch I ever bought. And I'm going to tell you I was probably 12 or 13 years old, and I bought a Seiko chronograph that sits in my safe deposit box that doesn't work, but I would never ever sell it. As a matter of fact, one of these days I'm going to take it out and have it repaired and just wear it for nostalgia purposes. But where I really got interested, serious about watches, was probably when I was in my late 20s, and I started to make some money, and I went into a jewelry store in Queens, and there was a pre-owned Rolex Oyster on an expansion bracelet. It was from 1963, and it was stamped. It was 18 karat gold, no date, black face. I paid $1,600 for it and wore it proudly, probably for about 5 or 6 years, and eventually traded it in to a dealer here in town. I think I got $3,000 for it, and I thought I hit the lottery, because in my life I never thought you could make money with something that was pre-owned, especially a watch. And unfortunately, I wish I still had the watch, because it's still pretty fashionable. But that, I would tell you, probably in the late 80s is when I got the bug for watches. When I went into business from 81 to 86, I didn't have any real money. I just had a great skill and was paid very handsomely. But my partners at the time, and I owned a small piece of this company. It was called Vanguard. All of them wore either it was the Rolex President, or trying to think of another watch. Or there were Omegas, or back then Movado was a really hot watch, or Ebel. Ebel was a really hot watch, and I remember also probably the first really expensive watch that I bought prior to the used Rolex, and we're talking about Ebel, was I was in St. Martin with my girlfriend, and she asked me to borrow $100. She wanted to go play roulette, and I don't know, I went up to the room, and about 2 hours later she came back upstairs with $5,000, and she bought me an Ebel tank watch. I've never seen it, with diamonds on both sides. It was magnificent. And she bought herself a Rolex. That's another watch I wish I never sold, but I did.
The interesting thing is that, with all respect, you did not grow up being exposed to luxury, fancy cars. What do you think make you appreciate these items?
Well, I knew when I started to work, even when I was a counterman working for Nathan's, the Nathan's I worked at was in a very wealthy area.
Okay.
And at 15 on a Saturday, or 16, I'd be behind the counter, and I would see the kids from my high school who were very, very wealthy, had beautiful cars, beautiful girlfriends, come in, and I would be in my black pants and my red shirt and my little cap on. And I said, one day I'd like to be able to drive one of those cars, or I know if I kept working, and believe it or not, I thought there was nothing else I could ever do in my life other than work in a restaurant. I said, if I work really hard, I'll be able to achieve those things. And when I got into the automobile leasing business back in 1977, I was a transporter, I was a driver. So, the first day, my bosses said to me, we need you to bring this Mercedes into the city. And they gave me the address, and I said, no problem. And I got in the car. Obviously, I knew how to drive. There were no cell phones. I pulled over the side of the road. I called my dad and said, Dad, how do I get to 317 East 34th Street? And he gave me directions. I was afraid to ask them. But then, as time went on, I drove Jensens and Rolls Royces. And when you drive those cars as a very young kid, basically coming from nothing, it gives you a passion of what really life is all about. And in retrospect, those cars really, compared to what cars are today, were inexpensive. You could buy a new Rolls Royce for $50,000 back in 1977, which was a lot of money. But today, new Rolls Royce is $350,000, $400,000. A Mercedes, like one of my cars that I really love, is the 280 SL. I remember driving one into the city for my bosses, and they had sold it to a dealer, and they sold it to the dealer for $9,000 or $10,000, and the car was amazing. I didn't have the $9,000 or $10,000. I was living with my folks. And then later on, when I grew up, I ended up buying 4 or 5 of them just to have them, and sold them. And today they're $150,000 or $200,000, depending on how nice the car is. But as time goes on, you realize what's important in life and what's not important. If you took a step back, cars are not important. Watches are really not important. You just have to be happy with yourself and happy with your family. But those things definitely help. They definitely do.
And right now, in terms of appreciation of watches, what are you looking for when you buy a watch? And do you have a brand in particular, you affection in particular?
I love Rolex. I love Patek. And I've owned APs. I know the FP Journe. I just bought one. I had one once before. My passion really is, once again, I'm going to say the older stuff. The new watches are beautiful, the new Rolexes and stuff, and I have great relationships with several dealers throughout the United States that if I get on a list and the watch comes in, it's not like I'm a stranger. I wear them, I enjoy them, I'm thankful to get them, but I really love the older stuff. I'm not a real techie, but I'm starting to look at Instagram, and if you have a passion with Instagram, it kind of sets you up to what your passion is. So every morning I'm looking through to see who has what, and to all those used watch dealers, it definitely works, because I've met dealers all over the country where a watch comes in and it's on Instagram, and I would call or email and develop a relationship with them, and buy and sell a lot of watches. Mostly buy.
When you buy a vintage, what are you looking for?
I like Rolex.
But not the brand. What makes you buy a watch?
The rarity.
Condition,
the rarity of the watch, the condition, obviously, the price commensurate to the piece that I'm looking at. In the car business, and the car business has a lot of similarities to the watch business. I've been taught, because my partners are huge worldwide collectors, you always buy the best that you can find, pay more, because it will always be worth more if ever you want to sell. And I don't like to sell, I like to buy. Of course, I do sell from time to time. The same thing happens to be true with watches. Buy the best watch you can. Don't buy a Frankenstein, and I have plenty of friends that I go to if I buy something, and I'd like to think I know a bit about watches, but I have friends that are dealers, such as you, Laurent. I'm going to show you a watch in a little while I just got, to get your opinion of it. Buy the best. It will always be worth more. Don't buy a watch with a story. Don't buy a watch, or try not to buy a watch that's had too much work done on it, that's been polished too many times. You'll never see me with a watch on that looks like I built a house with it and it's scratched and everything. But it doesn't have to be shiny, shiny, shiny. Definitely doesn't.
But if you go back 50 years with your experience, what would be your advice to a young kid who is not a little money to start to collect watches? What you would tell him?
I would tell him, depending on how much he wanted to spend, to stay with the brands that are popular. As a young man growing up, I bought a lot of watches. I made some mistakes. I bought with my heart and not my head. And with watches, you kind of have to do both. You buy what you like to wear. If you're going to buy it and stick it in the safe, don't buy it. Unless you're a collector and you think one day it's going to be worth a lot of money. Wear your watches. So for that young collector, I would stick with Rolex. I would stick with Patek, even the least expensive Patek that you could find. Of course, this goes through price ranges. Omega, although I don't have any Omegas, I would say it's a watch that's pretty fairly priced. It's an excellent watch. And I always think that, when you go to sell and upgrade, depending on the watch, you're not going to lose your shirt. There's always a market for it. Like there's always a market for Rolex and Patek, and a lot of the new brands that are out that are becoming popular, Journe, Longa, just to mention a few.
And then comes the food, which is you love cars, watches, and food. And what is the common denominator of these three things? I mean, when I say food, it's food slash wine.
Right,
we're going to put it together. But what do you think? What do you think in common? What do you think so many people love? Cars, watches, and food.
Because they've reached a stature in their lives where they're comfortable financially. You know, there are some people that live to eat, and there's some people that eat to live. I'd like to say the watch car person lives to eat, loves to go out in their car with their wife, with a girlfriend, with a boyfriend, drive to a nice restaurant, wear a beautiful watch. Because people notice watches, you know, they definitely do. And have a good meal, have a great bottle of wine, have a couple of drinks, and just enjoy themselves. You know, I love wine. I used to have a 1,000-bottle cellar. I don't drink wine as much as I used to at the moment, but I love it. You know, it's a great drink, and everything goes hand in hand. Wine, watches, cars. It's all the finer things in life.
And as a businessman, and as the world is really changing today, how do you see in 20 years the world of antique cars, exotic cars, the world of watches, and
wine?
And wine. How do you think that these three big industries are going to be in 20 years from now?
Well, it's interesting. Let's talk watches first. There was this fallacy that with cell phones, people would stop wearing watches. That I heard a couple of months ago from some of my friends in the watch business, that, you know, people are going to stop wearing watches and use their cell phone to tell the time. And what's really crazy is when I met my girlfriend, who I'm dating the last 2 years, she didn't own a watch. She wanted to see what time it was. She looked at a phone and she knew what time it was, and phones are pretty accurate. But I don't see people ever not wearing watches. You know, watches is a status symbol. It really is. Some people, they wear them just to tell the time. But as a businessman, if you're in a meeting, and it's really weird, if you're in a meeting and you have a beautiful watch on, and you're with people in suits, people who are dressed up, people are going to notice what you're wearing. But what's crazy is you can wear an Apple Watch with a suit and still get away with it. Not saying that that's the only thing that people wear, but I talk to a lot of my friends that are crazy watch people, and so what are you wearing today? I'm wearing my Apple Watch. I'm having a good time with it. I can answer the phone with it. I don't wear it every day, but it's a cool watch. I don't think the watch business is going to go away. I think it only gets better. The manufacturers are building one less watch than the demand of the people that want to buy them. Patek and Rolex, especially today, they've created a market, they created a demand, and their watches will always be hot. You know, you have a manufacturer like a Breitling that makes so many different watches and floods the market. There's no real demand, you know. Not knocking Breitling, but just saying that make a lot of watches. And there's no really special edition, at least to the best of my knowledge, that you couldn't get without going on the internet if your local dealer didn't have one. Not the same with Rolex, with Patek, with Lange, or Journe. As far as cars are concerned, the right car in years to come will always be worth big money. People will always love cars. Much like the cell phone and telling time in car and watches, The same thing with gas engines and electric cars. I'm not an electric car guy. I think, at least in my lifetime and in my children's lifetime, maybe not in their children's lifetime, people are always going to want to smell oil and gas. They're going to want to hear an engine. When I was in an electric car, my partner owned a Fisker dealership when Fisker was in business, and I took the car for a ride. And it was really smooth. I didn't know how fast I was going until I looked at the odometer on the car. It was on 95. I was doing 90 miles an hour, but you don't feel it because there's no roar of the engine. It's like being in a toy car. So I would never own one, although I know plenty of people that love them. You know, the what are they called? Susan has one.
Tesla.
The Tesla. You know, great cars, people love them. I deal with a lot of athletes as customers, and there was a craze, a time where they only want to drive Teslas, which is crazy. Well, that's over with now.
Do you think that, for example, today you see a car and you say, oh, it's a beautiful car.
Yeah.
But 3 years and 5 years down the road, you look at the car and nothing special. I mean, like Mercedes. I mean, some of the Mercedes, the new SL models, they don't age very well. However, when you talk of the 1917 to 80 SL, these cars are going throughout the time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's the same with watches, that contemporary watches today, who may look very appealing, may not have the same appearance or the same feeling that a Patek from 1958?
I think, again, it depends on the brand. If we're talking Patek and Rolex, I think depending on the ones, the entry-level ones, which may not be the case with the new different colored Rolex faces on their Oyster, those ones won't be worth the same in 5 or 10 years. In 20 or 30 years, it's another story. I think in time, any fine piece of machinery is going to be worth more than it cost originally when it comes to watches. And when it comes to certain cars, like cars today are really mass produced. There's no one car I can say that if you buy it today, perhaps other than a very special Ferrari, that's very hard to get, will be worth so much more money in 20 years. There's nothing in the Bentley line, there's nothing in the Rolls line, certainly in the Mercedes line and BMW line and Lamborghini line, that you could buy today and say in 20 years it's going to be worth more money than it was today. I think the last car that BMW made that was still worth a lot of money is a Z8.
Oh.
The little two-door coupe. I mean,
I love it.
That was a early 2000s car.
Beautiful car.
It came in, I think it was $150,000, and then it went to $250,000 and $300,000. Now it's probably down to $150,000 to $200,000. That car will always be worth money. But post that, I don't think BMW made anything. And Mercedes as well. 1991 and newer are different than I know with Mercedes, and I'm a Mercedes fan. Prior to 1991, the cars were wonderful.
As a collector, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Collector of what?
Watches or cars? I don't know if you...
I do have some old cars.
Do you have a list?
What? A bucket list?
A bucket list?
No, not really. I'm going to tell you, I drove everything I really want to drive in my lifetime. You know,
got it.
I'm going to tell you, with a couple of exceptions, I've never driven an old Corvette. Whether it's a Stingray or the old cars from the late 50s and early 60s. I never drove them. I like to drive one. Not to own it, but just to drive it. You know, I've driven old Rollses, I've driven old Ferraris, old Mercedes, old BMWs.
Is he Cobra?
I've driven in it, but not driven one myself. That car I really have no interest in driving. myself. It's too fast in an area that you really can't go fast in, you know. And they're worth so much money that I'd be afraid something would happen to it, you know, something jump up off the road and hit the car, and chances are it wouldn't be my car, it'd be a customer's car. I do have one very special customer that has a collection of them. He's a wonderful man. He has an auto museum in Pennsylvania, and he's got quite a collection of them, and he loves them. I don't get the car, but I'm not a speed freak, so it doesn't make a difference.
And in terms of watches?
You know, pretty much I buy what I want, you know, within a limit. You know, I have friends that, you know, crazy stories that were looking for a certain kind of Patek and sent one of the watch dealers to South America to buy, and, you know, paid $1 million. And to me, I would never buy a watch for $1 million. I mean, first of all, I couldn't afford it. Second of all, I couldn't see it. You know, I would be too uncomfortable wearing it, that someone would chop off my hand. So I pretty much, you know, and I buy and sell a lot of watches. I buy a lot of watches. Anything I really want, I pretty much buy. I love the new Rolex line. You know, I've had a bunch of them, and Patek has some beautiful watches that are out right now. But like an old car guy, I'm an old watch guy now. I like older watches. And I would tell you again, buy the best. Because if you ever want to sell and buy something else, there'll be no excuses. You have the best. Box and papers, not polished or polished to a minimal amount, original, you know, stuff like that.
What have you made your best dishes?
Pardon me?
Which meal you like the best?
Well, I'm known for chicken. You know, my mom, God rest her soul, was a great cook, and she taught me how to cook certain things, and one of them was chicken. So anybody knows if there was a contest for making chicken, any way you want it, Steven would win, or he'd be in the running. I cook everything, you know, whether it's pasta and truffles, or bolognese sauce, or homemade chicken soup, or roast beef, or special kind of potatoes, or cream spinach, or you know, all of that stuff. Not gourmet, but just food that when I see people sit down and they take their first bite and they smile, that makes me feel good. It really does. I started cooking. I was a baker. I stopped baking probably when I was a little kid. My grandmother taught me how to bake. She lived with us. She was blind. She taught me how to bake bread and bake cookies and pies and stuff like that. But baking is such a science. If you screw up in one area or the other and it doesn't taste good, there's really not much you can do. But with cooking, you know, you always can add a little more salt, a little less salt, a little more pepper, a little more sage, you know, depending on what it is. And then in some dishes you just master it, and you don't need to look in a cookbook. You just know how to do it.
All right, then I think I had all my answers to the questions, and I do thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.